Hello everybody! Today I'm going to give some recommendations. I don't do recommendation videos that frequently because I find them incredibly intimidating to do. It's just hard sometimes, but I've wanted to do a video on the topic of science fiction that features linguistics, xenolinguistics or alien languages, and interspecies communication. This is one of my favorite topics in science fiction. I absolutely love science fiction books that deal with linguistics in some way or another. This is going to be split up into two batches. The first are going to be the books or short stories that are super on theme here, my highest recommendations, and then I'm going to have a second batch which are kind of tangential to the theme, or books that, while I liked them, I didn't super love them. Like, they're not my favorites, but I still wanted to mention them. So let's get into it right away with the books that I would recommend most highly that are science fiction that feature linguistics or xenolinguistics. First up is Semiosis by Sue Burke. This novel is about a group of colonists from Earth who land on the wrong planet, but they have to stay there anyway. They start to eke out a life for themselves in a world that is both incompatible with human life, but also inimical to them. Everything around them, especially the biome, the plant life, seems like it's very hostile and is trying to kill them in one way or the other. And then later on in the story, as we go through the generations of the colonists, they encounter actual sentient life on the planet, and they begin communicating with it. My favorite thing about this scenario probably is that it's the only science fiction novel I think I've ever read that has to do with human-plant life communication. There is an actual sentient being on this planet that becomes a protagonist and point of view character later on, and it is a plant, basically. And it does find a way to communicate with the humans, and I was just blown away by that concept. Then we have a two-parter. These are the only books that I'm recommending that I don't own copies of because I don't know why. I have to fix that at some point. These are Children of Time and Children of Ruin by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I loved both of these pretty specifically for their descriptions of alien life and very different species learning to communicate with each other, and also just flat out how very inhuman species communicate when their anatomies and their brain structures are so different from ours. So in the first book, Children of Time, this features spiders. Now, I am an arachnophobe. I hate spiders. I don't like looking at them. It's the shape of spider bodies and the way that they move that really scares me. So it's interesting that in this book, Tchaikovsky managed to make me really interested in how spiders actually speak to each other with their legs and their arms and their webs and the vibrations and everything. And then what happens when they meet up with humans and have to communicate across the species boundary. And of course, the humans in the story are also terrified of spiders, which is in and of itself kind of a psychological block to communication and cooperation. But overall, this is one of the things I love the most about this book, is just how would humans and spiders end up talking to each other, either directly or through an intermediary, and how that all would work. The second book is even more focused on linguistics, I think. In this one, the spiders, which are called the Sophids, I believe, have actually teamed up with the humans. They are out doing their own exploration of the universe together, and they encounter a third species that they have to communicate with, which is also, in its way, a children of humans, like uplifted children of humans, much like the spiders were. So in this one, we have actual linguists as characters. They're like two different groups of humans and spiders who are working to develop a real-time automatic translation method between spiders and humans, and they are suddenly thrust into first contact with another species and have to use their skills with linguistics and their technology and everything to start figuring out the other species' communication. So yes, These two books, Children of Time and Children of Ruin, I particularly loved because of the interspecies communication in them. Next up is A Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, which is collected in his first short story collection called Stories of Your Life and Others. This is a pretty obvious recommendation to make right now. I think a lot of people know about this story because it was recently adapted to be the movie Arrival, which I think is an excellent adaptation of it. Story of Your Life is one of my favorite short stories ever. I am very emotionally attached to it. Every time I read it, I weep. It's so good. And it is about a woman who is a linguist who works like kind of in Xenolinguistics, who helps make first contact with an alien species that comes to Earth, learns their language, and in the process of learning their language, it affects the way that she perceives time, kind of the past, the present, and the future all at once. Now, this is a story that I think at its heart is dealing with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that language, what somebody speaks, will affect the way that they can think and perceive the world and how they can behave. So in that way, that's how the woman in the story, she changes, she perceives the universe and time differently when she learns an alien language. And it's a very beautiful story. There's far more to it than just the linguistics, let's say. It's a very emotional story for me, and it is such a good one. Another book that runs with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is Embassy Town by China Miéville. Now, I want to say at this point that I'm pretty sure that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis has never been proven and maybe isn't taken as seriously these days as it once was, but it has certainly fueled many, many science fiction writers. Embassy Town is about a woman, a human woman, who is an ambassador between, of course, humans and an alien species that has a very, very strange language, where it's very clear that unless they have a word for something, they don't perceive it, they don't understand it. And much of the story, if I recall correctly, is about attempting to change the way that the aliens think by changing their language, by giving them more words and helping them to think in a different way. At the time that I read it, I thought it was incredibly powerful, and just, I got to the end, was like, wow, that was so intellectually interesting. I found it very difficult to describe it afterwards, though. I'm probably making a hash job of it right now. But yes, this was great. I do think it might be a book that's a bit difficult for some people to get into. It took me 2 attempts to read it. The first time, I just couldn't. It felt too dark and complex, and I wasn't in the right headspace. But when I came back to it years later, it was the perfect book at the right time. My last 2 recommendations along the main theme here are both shorter works that are translated. The first one is Everything is Made of Letters by Sofia Rhei. There are 5 stories in this, and they're all translated by different people. This one I want to recommend particularly for one of the stories, which is called Learning Report, I believe. Yes, Learning Report. That one is about an actual linguist who integrates into an alien society in order to learn their language and to report back on it. The aliens tell her that she must go through their education system in order to learn the language properly. She can't skip any of the steps. She has to go straight into school with little children and work her way through the system. And there's a reason for that, and she discovers what the reason is. I love this particular story, but I will also say that this entire collection, all of the stories are about language. Learning Report, I think, is the only one that deals with Xenolinguistics, but if you would just enjoy reading science fiction about language and writing and reading and the importance of the written word and everything, this is a great collection overall for that. And then there is a book where the title says it all, Monteverde, Memoirs of an Interstellar Linguist by Lola Robles, translated by Lawrence Schimmel. This is a short novella, once again, about a woman who is a linguist who goes to another planet to make contact with some communities there and learn their their language. I think there are actually two communities. She goes to visit one, but also wants to make contact with the other, which is much harder to reach and may not want to talk to her at all. This novella reminded me very strongly of Ursula K. Le Guin's fiction. It does actually bear some resemblance to some of Le Guin's short stories, including some ones I may mention later, in that it is a linguist, a woman, going to an alien planet, and it's kind of in a report format. It just struck me as very familiar, but also as very beautiful and interesting, and I just highly recommend Monteverde. Now moving on to the second batch of books, which are ones that are maybe a bit more adjacent to the theme, but I still wanted to mention them, or they're books I enjoyed, I just don't necessarily know if they're my favorites anymore. So first up, I want to mention two quite short stories by Ursula Le Guin. I have both of them in The Unreal and the Real, the second volume, but they're collected in many of her other collections as well. The first one is called The Silence of the Asonu. This is a story I've read multiple times and really enjoyed it every time I've read it. It's a very anthropological story describing the Asonu and their silence, why they don't speak and such, and I love it. And the second one is the author of the Acacia Seeds and other extracts from the Journal of the Association of Xenolinguistics. This is the one that I think of when I'm reading stories like Monteverde, because it is kind of in that report format, somebody reporting back on their expedition to learn about a culture and their language and such. Those are just two of the stories that come to mind when I think of Ursula Le Guin and science fiction and language. I might also throw in just a quick mention of The Telling, which is one of the Hainish novels. It's not about outright language learning necessarily, but it is about uncovering a hidden and censored culture and the language and written word and works of that culture as well. It's also a beautiful story. Next, we have Foreigner by C.J. Cherryh. I loved this book when I was a kid. I haven't reread it in many years, and so I'm not exactly sure if I think it's as amazing as I did when I was younger. But Foreigner was a perfect book for me back in the day because the main character is a human man living in a small human community on an alien planet. He is an ambassador and a translator between the humans and the aliens, who are called the Atevi. And I love the idea of the protagonist of the early books being a translator. That's what his main purpose is. Of course, his role expands to many more things as he's pretty politically involved, being the only link between two very different cultures. But I think that C.J. Cherryh is really, really good at creating inhuman alien species, even if they are humanoid like the Atevi are. She definitely has a way of showing that her aliens think and behave differently, and the friction and the tension and the confusion that can occur between the aliens and the humans, and they just can't get past that mental divide. Because I think in particular the Atevi simply don't have some concepts that humans do, like love or romantic attachment. And trying to translate around that must be very interesting. Then there is Amatka by Karin Tidbeck. It's such a beautiful novel. It's such an amazing atmosphere built up in this book. That's what I really loved it for. But it does feature a language that is used to manipulate stuff, to manipulate and shape the world and to create objects and things. And that is a really interesting concept. And the last book, any recommendations list that doesn't feature Babel 17 by Samuel R. Delany is probably defective in some way. Once again, a science fiction novel that takes the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and runs with it. It has been years since I read this book. I think I did a review of it many years ago, actually. And it is about a woman who is basically a poet, like a genius poet, who I think is trying to uncover a language, Babel 17, that can be used to manipulate people, to change their minds, to have them think and behave differently. And this was the first thing I ever read by Delaney. It really impressed me. It's quite old at this point, and I just thought it was so well written, and it was fantastic for having a really well-drawn female character as the protagonist. And yeah, when we talk about science fiction novels and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, this is going to be the first one that many people mention. Those are all the books I have to recommend along this topic right now. Hopefully I will discover many more in the future because I just love reading about this so much. If you know of any science fiction novels that deal with language and its many aspects, definitely let me know because I'm always looking for recommendations on this topic myself. Let me know if you have read any of these books and what you thought about them. Leave me some comments down below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back tomorrow with another video, and until then, bye.